Hello, everyone. Today I'm going to talk about Hercule Poirot's Christmas by Agatha Christie, which is, I think, the 20th book in the Poirot series. Now, despite its name, the novel is only very loosely Christmas-themed, if you could even say that, and it could be read at any time of the year. Although for reasons I'll get into soon, I wouldn't necessarily recommend it offhand. Now, I'll start with a spoiler-free section, and then let you know when I'm going into the spoiler-filled section. Also, a quick comment, there is actually a spoiler in this book itself for the earlier and arguably more enjoyable Poirot novel, Three-Act Tragedy. You wouldn't necessarily even notice the reference if you haven't read that one before, but it just refers to a few named characters from the other mystery, so just be warned about that. This book felt far too much like a cookie-cutter Poirot novel, without the true charm that they often have. Upon completion, I consider the question, what really stands out about this novel? Answer is unfortunately nothing. Okay, that's not strictly true. There are a few things that stand out in the solution and its reveal, but none of these things are evident enough to make the novel memorable, and some of the unique elements seem to me more preposterous than clever. I found myself getting a bit annoyed right from the beginning of the novel in the way the first descriptions are presented. We see a man and a woman meeting for the first time on a train, and we're told that they're suspicious. Why? No clear reason. We just hear each of them considering some vague personal thoughts that have to do with doing something and being worried about it. Although this way of introduction maybe works on occasion, it's usually less effective to me than just letting us readers observe the characters and seeing them do things that look vaguely suspicious and starting to form our own questions. I think for me this is a case of show, don't tell, which seems weird to me to be saying about Agatha Christie's writing because she's an excellent writer. But the writing in this novel just didn't quite seem to live up to her normal standards. Now, maybe I've just read too much Agatha Christie lately, so I'm being hypercritical. But in my mind, at least, there is a sharp contrast between this introduction and, say, the intro to Murder on the Blue Train. Now, that's an introduction that instantly created a mysterious atmosphere. It grabbed my attention, and I was immediately wondering who these characters are and which side they're on. I definitely would recommend reading that one if you haven't gotten a chance yet. I'd also argue that not every character needs to appear instantly suspicious in a detective story. I mean, this is a murder mystery, so I don't need to hear a character thinking suspicious thoughts for me to be suspicious of them. I'm just automatically going to be suspicious of any character, especially characters that don't seem immediately and inherently suspicious. And because in this book, every character had these huge but vague question marks over their head right from the start, in a strange way, it actually kind of made me less interested to learn more about these characters and their motivations. Now, the first hour of the book followed a similar formulaic sort of pattern, and it was really difficult for me to read. Like the previous book, Appointment with Death, which I read right before this, we again have a family of several children who have a shaky relationship with, in this case, their father, who is kind of a one-dimensional and unsympathetic character and will, of course, be murdered once all the suspects to be arrive in the same place. Unfortunately, the introduction of the Lee family in Hercule Poirot's Christmas was far less interesting to me than the introduction of the Boyntons in Appointment with Death, and because of this, it took me much longer to get into this novel. In Appointment with Death, Agatha Christie introduces the central family through the observative and psychoanalytical lens of their fellow travelers, who are, of course, meeting this family for the first time, so we as readers can interpret that accordingly. In contrast, in Hercule Poirot's Christmas, the first hour or so of reading is like perusing a dry biography of a random and seemingly pretty normal British family. We're introduced to three different couples, one after another, and each of these couples has a really unnatural conversation. I've sometimes heard this kind of conversation described as the maid and butler dialogue, even though it's not literally a maid and a butler on this occasion, but they ask each other these questions that seem to serve no purpose other than just enumerating facts for the reader. For an example, one character casually learns from her husband, presumably for the first time, that he has an estranged brother, Harry, who he's just never happened to mention before. She seems mildly interested then, but not at all bothered by such an omission. Within these conversations, there's also a reason established for why we should be suspicious of every single one of these characters, and some of them are as vague as someone saying they just don't know what to do about it, an unspecified thing that they're worried about. And then, on the other hand, we have one character who, after the conversation, goes to her desk and pulls out a huge stack of unpaid bills to ruminate on right before we cut to the next character intro. The characters, aside from the conniving old Simeon Lee, the father of the other Lees, aren't particularly memorable, which makes it hard to remember who said what when this later becomes important. Now sure, Agatha Christie's characters have never felt quite lifelike, and that sometimes works to her benefit, giving them a cartoonish charm. But these ones feel incredibly one-dimensional at times. The stodgy member of Parliament who's frugal with his wallet and his flirtatious spendthrift wife. The more emotionally sensitive son and his loyal, i.e. boring, wife. The loyal, i.e. boring son and his caring and independent wife. And then there's the prodigal son of the family. That last one isn't even my own assessment. He's literally referred to as the prodigal son by at least 3 separate characters, including himself, in the first half of the novel. There are also Stephen and Pilar, the man and woman who met on a train at the beginning of the novel, and it will be unclear to the reader for quite some time just why exactly they are here, other than just to have more suspects. The central premise of this novel is also not super exciting, that an ill-humored and bored father is inviting all of his children back for Christmas for seemingly no reason other than so that he can torment them and pit them against one another for his own amusement. They all seem quite reluctant at first and then accept his offer for reasons that are also not very interesting. The father, Simeon Lee, keeps a necklace of uncut diamonds in his room, which seems to be one of his most treasured possessions, since he pulls it out frequently from time to time just to admire, and of course to show off to all of his guests, including those who he's meeting for the first time, just so that the reader knows that every character knows that it could be worth stealing. These premises are maybe believable, but they're far from new or interesting. Also, for a novel with Christmas in the title, Christmas plays very little thematic role here. It's merely a pretext for the father to force his family all together. Because of all this, it took me a really long time to get into this novel. Like, a really long time. I'd say we were probably about 2/3 of the way through the story before I somewhat started caring about what happened. And even then, I was kind of less interested in navigating all the red herrings, as I often do in a Poirot novel, and instead opted to just collect the information and see what happened rather than hold myself to my normal investigative standards. I'm glad I made this decision, though, because it made the rest of the story a little bit more enjoyable, and frankly, I very likely would have gotten it wrong and been disappointed at the end if I'd been more thorough in thinking it all through. As for the mystery, I think sometimes Agatha Christie just gets a little bit too carried away with drawing readers in the wrong direction, so much so that instead of actually gathering clues and evidence and like playing the room, so to speak, I find myself playing the author and figuring out what Christie is trying to make me think and why that means it can't possibly be true. I admit this is probably my own problem for being over-analytical, but it also is remarkably effective for ruling out possibilities. Is this novel or its solution too predictable? No, but in a way, Christie's novels have become for me predictable in their unpredictability, if that makes any sense. I find myself drawing the right conclusions not because there's any evidence, but because I think, boy, it would be wild if this happened, or there's no way this person could be the murderer, so my guess is it is that person. What exactly do I mean by that? Well, to say any more, I'm going to have to get into some spoilers here. Before that, though, I'll just wrap up the spoiler-free section by saying this was just an okay mystery. I gave it 2 out of 5 stars. I've certainly read far worse, but for me, this wasn't up to Agatha Christie's usual standards, and I wouldn't really recommend it unless you're trying to hit every novel in the Poirot series. Okay, with that, I'm going to head into the spoiler section. Okay, the mystery itself. Like I said, in this book, more than usual, we see a lot of things that are so obvious that we can just rule them out as possibilities, or they're seemingly so unlikely that we should wonder whether that makes them likely. For example, the scene of the crime is described as so gruesome that one of the characters quotes Lady Macbeth, "Who would have thought that the old man would have so much blood?" I suspected from the start that this blood was fake and the whole murder scene was staged, but not because there was any reason to believe otherwise, just because it seemed like a Christie sort of thing to do. I think I would have preferred if Christie made at least some of the original suggestions to be correct, because once I start believing nothing the characters or even the detectives say, I begin losing interest in the case. The final solution is also something I imagine readers may find controversial, and I didn't love it myself. I can't say I predicted the ending, but honestly, pretty much right towards the beginning, when the policeman first appears, I actually thought to myself, I wonder if this is going to be the one where it ends up being the policeman. And I didn't really have anything to go off. I just thought it was weird that the policeman was on the scene in this way before the crime actually happened, and that his statements about this weren't actually verifiable. There was also the butler's emphatic impression of deja vu whenever he opened the door. I think was a little bit of a clue to this as well. Later in the novel, Poirot also mentions having seen a ghost, although I think this sentence could reasonably have referred to quite a few different things with what we knew at the time. And I didn't make any connection with Superintendent Sugden from that particular statement. I tucked what I did notice about Sugden into the back of my mind as a possibility, but decided it was pretty unlikely because, it's time to talk about the controversial part, I guess. So, it's an implicit rule in whodunits that the detective isn't the murderer. Actually, it's not always even just implicit. One member of the detective novel community during the Golden Age literally wrote the 10 Commandments of detective fiction, and number 7 on that list is the detective shall not commit the crime. Now, sure, Poirot is officially the detective here, but the reader typically can extrapolate this to mean that the police the detective partners with didn't commit the crime either. Rules are, of course, meant to be broken, and Agatha Christie was never one to abide by the rules if she could help it. But rules are also there for a good reason. They're a tacit agreement between the author and the reader that the author is giving the reader a fair shot to solve the mystery by setting certain ground rules about who is and isn't under suspicion. The fact that I briefly considered Sugden as a suspect but then canceled him out because it should never be the policeman, to me that made me wonder whether he really was fair game. Then again, though, maybe the fact that I considered him at all when normally I never think twice about the policeman is actually an indication that Christie did this well. I want to think about this just a bit more because I'm really curious about what makes a mystery plot work well or not. So does it work for Agatha Christie to have made the policeman the murderer here? I'm going to say, and you might disagree with this, but I say in a typical detective mystery, if it's theoretically plausible that the police officer could have been involved, but there's also reasonable evidence against the other suspects, then for it to end up being the police officer in the end is a disappointment. On the other hand, if none of the usual suspects have reasonable suspicion remaining, but the police officer is just overwhelmingly suspicious, then yeah, the readers should be smart enough to say, forget the normal rules, there's something up with the police guy. So the question for me comes down to, did Christie give a sufficient indication that Sugden was not above suspicion? And did she eventually establish that we should be more suspicious of him than the other characters? I'd argue that it was ambiguous from the start whether Inspector Sugden was fair game. Christie never explicitly told us that the policeman or anyone else was above suspicion. I mean, Poirot, of course. And sometimes, of course, Poirot works with, say, Inspector Japp or Captain Hastings, and we remove these characters from suspicion. But for these characters, we see that Poirot, in a sense, endorses them as trustworthy. They may have an established track record, and we often see their internal thought processes, so we have good reason not to suspect them. In this case, Poirot hasn't actually worked with Sugden before, so he can't vouch for him in this way. If we assume, as I did, that Poirot is working with Sugden here, then it seems a little unfair that Sugden would be the killer, and I can't remember right now to what extent this was or wasn't implied. On the other hand, it also seemed pretty likely that the murder had happened before the time it was reported, and we knew by Sugden's own testimony that he was there twice, once briefly before and once briefly after the murder. And not because the household actually called the police, but because he claims to have been called by Simeon Lee himself. I think maybe we're supposed to doubt this claim, but frankly, Simeon Lee was already behaving in a very strange manner. And for readers like me trying to understand what Simeon's point even was in bringing together his estranged family, the idea that he's trying to catch one of them in the act of stealing his jewels seems very credible. So did we have sufficient early indication that Sugden wasn't above suspicion? I'd say maybe, but just barely. Coming at it from another angle, by the time of the reveal, considering all the facts, was Sugden clearly and unequivocally the most likely murderer? I'm not sure about that either. We did at least by then have enough evidence to conclude that the murder was unlikely to have happened as late as it seemed. I'd argue, though, from what we knew about the family members as suspects, our best evidence against them was that there simply wasn't much solid evidence incriminating anyone in particular. Not that they were clearly exonerated. We had seen and verified decent alibis for most of them at this point, but then given that we were made to doubt, rightfully so, the actual time of the murder, doesn't this make their alibis from the minutes before the murder a lot less relevant? I admit I wasn't paying quite close enough attention to just how long these alibis applied and when each person could have conceivably last interacted with the elder Mr. Lee, but I do have some doubts as to whether we really had enough evidence to be convinced that the perpetrator was someone outside of the family, or rather supposed to be outside of the family since Sugden turned out to be part of the family in the end after all. So with that in mind, I think a reader's best bet of coming to the right conclusion here from the evidence alone would have been to focus on the positive clues. Comments by Poirot, the butler answering the door, Sugden's behavior and comments himself, really anything that casts subtle suspicion on Sugden, as opposed to focusing on negative clues absolving the others. Still, was there enough of this evidence by the end to make Sugden's murderous actions the most likely remaining explanation? I'm not so sure there was, but let me know what you think. Okay, so all that said, I think you could technically make either case, that it was okay for Christie to have the policeman be the murderer here, or that it was just a little too blatantly disregarding the rules without sufficient justification. And my final verdict is that, sure, technically it's okay, so I'm not going to call the mystery police on Agatha Christie for breaking the rules, partly because after this book, we know that the police are the bad guys themselves. Honestly, though, I'm still a bit disappointed about how Christie did it here. Because really, I have nothing against the policeman being the murderer, but if that does happen, I want to see it done expertly in a way where it really just fits perfectly. And I know that Agatha Christie has that expert ability, so it was a bummer for me here to see it done in a way that was just, for me, okay, rather than utterly amazing. In this book, it felt to me as if by breaking the rules and making the policeman the murderer, she was compensating for the fact that the rest of the novel was formulaic and, dare I say it, boring. I just didn't find this a great book. I feel comfortable saying that because I really love many of the Poirot novels, and I really love Agatha Christie's writing at its best. I enjoy them in bursts, though, and I think I'm ready for a break from Poirot after this one. I can't say for sure if I personally just need something else for a while or if this novel just wasn't that good, but I didn't enjoy it all that much, and I rank it among the worst ones I've read in this series so far, 2 stars out of 5. That's just my opinion, though. Let me know in the comments what you thought, especially if you really liked it, or what you liked or didn't like about it. I'm also curious whether you thought that it was fair to make the policeman the murderer, but if you do comment about that, make sure to hide it in some way so that you're avoiding giving too many spoilers. Happy reading!